but you might know him more from the literature as the sociologist of education, when he held the position of John D. MacArthur Chair in Sociology and Education Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Among that, his research has been funded from many governmental and private sources. The most influential one, you might know, National Science Foundation. He also chaired the board for National Research Councils on Science Education. Last but not least, the important thing, he also influences the policy at the federal level in the United States, when he was twice appointed by President Obama to serve on the National Board for Education Sciences. So let me give the floor to Adam, and he will present the development and research on tracking from early on till nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for that introduction, and what a pleasure it is to be here today. This is not my first visit to Prague, but it is my first visit to Charles University, and it's really an honor to be here. You know, tracking is the topic that never dies. It is always relevant. I don't know who those people were, David, who told you in the United States that these are topics from the 80s, but I don't agree. There's still great interest in tracking in the U.S., and we've seen an explosion of interest in other countries. Policies about tracking in the U.S. have swung back the other way from the vigorous detracking movement of the 1980s and 1990s. So if someone were to say, well, that's an old issue, I think they might be saying, we're not all whooped up about this anymore. The detracking movement has subsided substantially, and tracking has been reinstituted generally. And I think we find this in many contexts where tracking is like a pendulum, swing in one direction and swing back the other direction. And different national systems seems to be on different parts of the swing at different times. So a detracking movement might be big in one country at one point and in another country at a different point, but all national systems seem to exhibit this kind of movement. Why is that? Well, it's because it's a complicated issue, and there's no single right answer to the tracking dilemma, which I hope to demonstrate in the course of my talk today. While it's true that we are not in the heyday of a detracking movement in the United States, tracking still looms as a major issue. It's part of many discussions. In some areas there's a hotbed of research activity, and I'll try to point to that as well. And so it's great to have the opportunity to talk about it. I'll begin with some basics, some long-standing research findings. Then I'll turn to some more recent and current research studies on tracking. And then finally, I will discuss some research that is pointing to new directions that might help us work through the tracking dilemma and find optimal approaches. So why do schools assign students to classes by ability? After all, it seems logical and efficient. Students differ in their performance levels, so it seems normal to divide students so that we can match instruction more closely to their needs. And a narrow range of student performance within a given class makes it easier to organize the curriculum. Well, seems straightforward. Why is it problematic? Well, although it seems straightforward, there are a number of problems that emerge with tracking. First, perhaps most important, is that due to circumstances outside of school, when we separate students according to their academic performance, we also separate them according to their social class backgrounds and their racial and ethnic backgrounds. So whereas it might be logical and efficient to arrange students on the basis of performance levels, arranging them also on the basis of social characteristics works against other values that we might have for education as a place of inclusion and cohesiveness. In addition, creating homogeneous classes, that is, classes that are homogeneous by performance levels, may lack the diversity that can lead to rich discussions in the instructional content. Moreover, although tracking is intended to provide equally effective instruction to all students, in practice, that rarely occurs. First of all, it's not only students but teachers who are also tracked, as teachers compete with one another for the opportunity to teach the most advanced students. Whoops. And teachers with the best reputations are often successful in that competition, and so they get to teach the honors classes, and teachers with weaker reputations or less skill or less experience are assigned to teach lower ability students. Moreover, tracking engenders a cycle of low expectations, where teachers confront a group of students who are assigned to that class because they have low performance levels. And so the teacher doesn't expect much from them. The students perceive those low expectations and respond accordingly, reinforcing the teacher's low expectations. And so the cycle continues. One author has described low-level classes as caricatures. That is, on the surface, they seem to be like regular classes. But if you focus more closely, you see that low-track classes often convey fragmented bits of information rather than coherent, in-depth curricular programs. And in low-track classes, we find an emphasis on procedures, whereas high-level classes have more opportunities for discussion, engagement with materials, and active interaction between teachers and students and among students. I'll give one example of this from the empirical literature. I could have chosen many. This is from a study that I was involved in about 12 years ago, focusing on tracking and unequal instruction, looking at the role of unequal instruction in accounting for the effects of tracking. So first you see 4 indicators of the quality of classroom instruction. The first at the top is discussion time. Now here, discussion is defined very narrowly as the free exchange of information among students, often without the intervention of teachers. And so this breaks the usual initiation, response, evaluation cycle that typically characterizes instruction, where students are freely sharing information with one another. It's pretty rare in secondary school classrooms. Mostly teachers are either lecturing or asking specific questions. The students answer, they evaluate the answer, and they move on to the next question. So discussion is pretty rare, but as you can see, it's more than 4 times more common in high-track classes as it is in low-track classes. This was a study from a large sample of schools in New York and Wisconsin. It appeared in American Education Research Journal. Envisionment is a process of pre-conceptualizing the instructional topic. Teachers take the students through, which is supposed to help engage them in the material. Again, you can, and this is on a standardized scale. So you can see that it's more than a standard deviation, more extensive in the high-track classes compared to low-track classes. High-track classes give more opportunities to students to revise their written work, and high-track students spend more time on instruction, more than twice as much time on homework as low-track classes. Partly this is because of what the students are willing to do, but it's also because of the assignments that teachers give. Middle-track classes tend to fall, mixed ability classes tend to fall in the middle, more similar to the middle-track classes. So we see these instructional differences across classes, and when we look at their implications for achievement, we find that the quality of instruction accounts for a substantial part of the effects of tracking on achievement. So the first bar represents the observed differences on a literature assessment between tracks in standard deviation units, so more than a full standard deviation gap between the high and low tracks. The second is controlling for student background conditions, because of course it's not random who gets assigned to the high and low track. When we control for student background condition, we find that it's about 0.8 of a standard deviation. But when we take account of instructional differences, the gap drops to half a standard deviation. So much of the difference in performance across track levels can be attributed to difference in instruction. So partly as a result of unequal classroom conditions, inequality between students assigned to high and low track classes widens over time. Now, there have been many replications of these findings. I only gave you one example, but just to give a more contemporary example, a paper recently appeared from Long, Conjur, and Yadarola. This was a focus on high school course taking. So do students take more or less advanced courses in high school? And the authors exhibit impacts on test scores, high school completion, post-secondary enrollment, and performance. So the experiences of tracking in high school are carried with students all the way into their post-secondary years, even onto their performance at the college level. These authors estimate their effects using propensity models to help adjust for the fact that assignment to different course-taking regimes is non-random, and nonetheless, the effects are as persistent as with the more regression-based model that I showed in my previous example. An interesting feature of this particular study is that the effects are largest for disadvantaged students. So disadvantaged students have the most to gain when they are placed in advanced course-taking opportunities. And in addition, the effects are largest for schools with the highest concentration of disadvantaged students. So there's both an individual and contextual interactions with course taking. So taking this evidence into account then, we see that tracking has no overall effect on the productivity of a school. That is, a school with tracking, without tracking, produces the same average level of performance, but that's because it hides advantages for students in high tracks and disadvantages for students in low tracks. So we can think about the effects of tracking in two ways. One, the effects on productivity, which is about nil, and the other, the effects on inequality, where tracking exacerbates inequality. Now, supporters of tracking tend to focus on productivity, particularly the advantages for high-achieving students of being in the high tracks, whereas critics of tracking focus on inequality. That is the extent to which tracking widens gaps between students over time. Since the critics and advocates look at different aspects of tracking, they tend to talk past one another. Both can be right, and they impose their values to determine the implications of tracking's effects for policy decisions. For decades, most of the research on tracking and ability grouping came from the US and the UK. And certainly in the heyday of my research, in the 90s and early part of the 2000s, most of the research on tracking came from the US and the UK. But that's no longer the case. Many new international studies have emerged since 2000, and international research, in my judgment, finds the same pattern as in the US and the UK. That is, tracking is linked to increasing inequality. So one way to look at international research on tracking is through the lens of the major international surveys. So a paper focusing on PISA found that achievement inequality increases more from fourth grade, or increases more over time in countries that track students in earlier grades. And from TIMSS, we find that, and this is through a comparison of the fourth grade TIMSS with the eighth grade TIMSS, that achievement inequality grows more in countries that use ability grouping between classes, that is, assign students to classes in math or in science on the basis of their prior performance levels. Now, tracking and grouping, of course, take different forms in different countries. So sometimes tracking is between schools. The students at one performance level go to one type of school, and students at a different performance level go to a different type of school. So Japan and Germany would be examples of between school tracking, although I'm very excited by the title of Michael's paper on detracking in Germany. So perhaps this is, perhaps I'm out of date in this point here. I'll be interested to hear. Another way of organizing tracking is within schools. In the US is an example where they're not separate, for the most part, they're not separate schools for students on different achievement trajectories. Rather, everybody's in the same comprehensive school, and students are assigned to classes subject by subject based on their prior performance levels. There are other cases where tracking can occur both between and within schools, and Taiwan and the UK are examples of this arrangement. Interestingly, the results of research across these different countries suggest that the results are the same irrespective of how tracking is organized. That is, tracking tends to reinforce inequality without enhancing overall productivity. So a new analysis of PISA provides confirmation of this general sense that one gathers from looking at case studies of countries separately. This is from the work of Anna Chmiel-Walensky, who's conducted a new analysis of PISA in which she contrasts academic versus vocational tracking as one form of tracking, and course-by-course tracking, such as is common in the United States. She finds similar achievement gaps across systems, irrespective of whether tracking is organized through broad academic and vocational tracks or on a subject-by-subject manner. Moreover, disparities in achievement by socioeconomic status are also similar across countries, irrespective of which approach they take to tracking. This finding, she argues, supports the maximally maintained inequality idea. You know, maximally maintained inequality is the idea that socioeconomic disparities persist despite the expansion of education, because persons from more privileged groups take advantage of expansion to get their kids into the higher and higher levels. And in this case, we see an example of effectively maintained inequality where, irrespective of how tracking is organized, inequality pops out either way. So this is a slide from, it's actually not from the paper itself, but from an online forum that was conducted about the paper, and I've shamelessly borrowed it for this presentation. So you can see here differences in achievement based on whether tracking is organized course by course or academic versus vocational streaming. You can see that in the course by course tracking, the largest gap is between the middle and the high group, and in the academic vocational streaming, the biggest difference is between the low and the middle group. But either way, the gap between the high and the low group is fairly similar, not statistically different. Now, there are a few exceptions to this general pattern of tracking magnifying inequality. And one of the most interesting exceptions is from a study of Taiwan, of education in Taiwan, which appeared quite some time ago in Sociology of Education. This article maintains that high-stakes examinations targeted at different achievement levels provides incentives for students to work hard at their studies in all levels. And as a result, tracking contributed not to larger achievement gaps, but to smaller achievement gaps. And while this might seem too good to be true, I've replicated these findings in both Israel and in Scotland. So in the Israel case, for example, we compared, my colleague Hannah Ayalon and I compared tracking in the US and in Israel. Now this was tracking within the academic programs, so not the academic vocational distinction, but within the academic programs, tracking into high versus low level classes in the US, and tracking into classes that led to more or fewer points on the matriculation examinations in Israel. And what these results showed is that in the US, the more extensive the tracking system, the larger the socioeconomic disparities in achievement, comparing one school to another. Whereas in Israel, the more extensive the tracking system, the more differentiated the academic program within a school, the lower the socioeconomic disparities. And this, we argued, is a reflection of the high-stakes examination for academic programs which were available at all levels in Israel. So whereas in the US, unless you're aiming for an elite university, it doesn't matter how you perform in high school. You just have to pass your courses, and otherwise it doesn't matter whether you get the top grades or mediocre grades, unless you're aiming for an elite university. In Israel, by contrast, how you perform matters at each level of the course, because that will affect your performance on the matriculation exam, which affects your labor market opportunities and your post-secondary education opportunities. So consequently, we found smaller socioeconomic disparities when there were incentives for performance across all levels. Now, international research, therefore, suggests that the effects of tracking and grouping depends on the context in which tracking is implemented. Incentives, as I've suggested, matter for low achievers. This is difficult to implement on a large scale, at least in the case of the United States. We've tried to use ability grouping as a way to raise standards, and that's been unsuccessful. So standards-based reform is the big focus in the United States right now, setting high standards, expecting all students to perform to those standards, and holding schools and, more recently, teachers accountable for students reaching those standards. So efforts to use ability grouping as a way to channel those standards-based efforts have not been successful, according to the research literature. So we've not been able to implement these lessons in the United States on any kind of large scale. Now, I mentioned that tracking is still a hot topic for research within the US. And the hottest line of work on tracking in the US right now is the implications of tracking for English language learners. That is, for young people from immigrant families whose first language is not English, come to school with limited proficiency in English. And a new line of researchers, led by Rebecca Callahan at the University of Texas, whose 2005 paper was really a landmark in this work, think about curricula for English language learners as a form of tracking. And this research demonstrates that track placement matters more than English language proficiency for academic performance. So there's a tendency to think that, well, children from immigrant families perform poorly in school because they're limited proficient in English. And of course their limited proficiency does affect their academic performance. But an even more important condition, as Callahan and a number of other people have demonstrated, even more important than their limited English proficiency is the fact that classes for English language learners are a form of tracking which holds back children's educational performance, as we've typically found with assignment to low track. So low track assignment holds back the advancement of English learners. Now, more recent research has shown that it's the failure to reclassify English learners as proficient in English that relegates them to a watered-down curriculum. I had the chance just a month ago at the annual meeting of the American Education Research Association to comment on a series of papers on this topic. And I was stunned to learn that children are judged to be limited in their English proficiency when they arrive in school. 6 years later, they're still judged limited English proficient. 6 years they've been in American public schools and they still can't speak English? What kind of a system are we running? Well, one reason for this is because they're assigned to these low-track, limited English proficient classes, and they don't have the opportunity to develop their language skills, and their expectations are lowered, just as in the case of tracking. So I think this group of researchers is quite correct to think of this as a new form of tracking, or an old form of tracking that's just being recognized in this way. Moreover, policies about classification of English language learners differ across state. Now that might be bad for children, but it's good for researchers, because variation can lay the basis for insight about the consequences of policies. And in fact, one of these studies that I read at AERA showed that a state that reclassified their students more quickly, Texas, produced better test scores over time than a state that was more hesitant to reclassify students as English learners, California. So what's going on here? Well, students who are limited English proficient are in this low-level track. And irrespective of their gains in academic proficiency, if they're in the low track, their academic performance is held back. So probably because the students who get reclassified as English proficient get access to richer academic content. Language policies differ not only across states, but even within schools and school districts. So the big debate in the US has been over English immersion approaches to boosting the proficiency, that is, you're in a class, only English is spoken, versus two language programs where students are taught in their native language, academic content, and also given instruction in English. So new research by Ilana Umansky and Sean Reardon shows that English immersion leads to faster reclassification, so that's good, but the two language programs have better results in the long run. So this complicates the tracking picture, because we said that lack of reclassification leads students to remain in a low track. So you would think that faster reclassification would be a good thing. But it turns out that the two-language approach to English language learners actually bolsters their academic content in the long run, so that it yields better results. Another study showed that English development classes help students right after they arrive, but they're harmful for students who are in them too long. So this delayed reclassification, where students get instruction in English language again and again and again, although it's beneficial at the beginning, ultimately it holds down their progress in academic subject because they're focusing on the language issues and not on the academic content. So it diverted students from rich academic content. So I submit that this new line of research on tracking for English language learners in the US has implications for European education systems. Ethnic minority groups have been increasing in size due to immigration, and ethnic inequality is increasingly recognized within European education systems. At least that's my sense from reading the literature. I'm sure you'll correct me and enlighten me. Tracking reinforces ethnic inequality in Europe just as it does in the US. Now, this is not a widespread topic from my reading of the evidence, of the literature, I mean, because ethnic inequalities does not tend to be the first thing that researchers in European context look at, but to the extent that it has been examined, I think this generalization holds. Tracking reinforces ethnic inequality in Europe just as it does in the United States. So I think this may be a productive direction for future research in Europe, just as it is in the United States. Now, what are we going to do about this? What are the possible responses to the tracking problem? Well, there are at least two responses. One is to reduce the use of tracking. If we're going to do that, then we need to provide challenging instruction to high achievers. Because as you've seen early in my presentation, typically instruction provided in mixed ability classes is less demanding and less rich than what high track students typically encounter. Alternatively, we can maintain our tracking systems. But if we do that, then we need to provide more effective instruction in low tracks. Because again, as I demonstrated earlier, commonly the quality of instruction in low tracks is unnecessarily simplified and not rigorous, and that's one of the reasons that low track students perform poorly. For English learners, we also need to break the link between English proficiency and access to academic content. Even as English learners need to work on improving their academic proficiency, we have to find ways of doing so without denying these students access to rich academic content. Now, new research suggests promising directions for both the reduced tracking and the maintained tracking responses. Conditions that support successful mixed ability teaching and conditions that support effective instruction in low groups are tracked. So the remainder of my talk, I'll try to give examples of each of these. First of all, cases of successful mixed ability teaching. And by that, I mean mixed ability teaching that not only enhances the learning of students in low track, but does so without reducing the academic performance of high achieving students, which is what commonly happens with mixed ability teaching. A second example is supplemental instruction for low track students, so where tracking is maintained, but low track students get extra instruction so as to help them keep pace. Third, grouping students to maximize learning. So here we have an example of persisting ability grouping, but in a way that maximizes learning not only for high achievers, but also for low achievers. The fourth example will be one in which teachers and students are matched in a way that each student has access to the teacher who's likely to get the most out of it. This is more in theory than in practice. So first of all, successful mixed ability teaching. So Carol Burris is a New York-based school principal and researcher who has demonstrated a successful case study of detracking in a New York school district. Now, this is rare. There have been many case studies of detracking. Most of them say it was really hard to do and it didn't work out. But by contrast, this study showed positive results. So what did they find? In this case, tracking was replaced with mixed ability teaching in middle and high school mathematics. And significant that they focused on mathematics because math, along with foreign language, is typically the most difficult subject to detrack because educators believe that in order to master advanced content, you have to first master the more simple content. So if you can't do arithmetic, we're not going to give you access to algebra because we don't believe you can do algebra unless you've mastered arithmetic. And so this conception of mathematics as a subject matter has made detracking very difficult. So it's especially meaningful that they've chosen mathematics as the context for this study. The result of this study was improved outcomes for low achievers without losses by high achievers. So the middle school reform involved an accelerated curriculum for all students and extra support workshops for struggling students. So basically everybody got the curriculum that was formally offered to the high achievers, and low achievers were expected to engage in extra support activities. Teachers also had common planning times. There was an increased use of calculators. At the high school level, all students were assigned to the Regents classes. Now, the state of New York is unusual in having long had a system of high-stakes examinations for high school students called the Regents exams. And unless you took the Regents courses, you couldn't take the Regents exam, then you couldn't get access to the prestigious universities. So in this reform, all students were assigned to the Regents classes, but there was a supplementary class for students who struggled with the more advanced material. This supplementary class met 3 times a week. So if it met 3 times a week, the regular classes meet 5 times a week. So that meant these kids were getting about 60% more instructional time. The research design was an interrupted time series. You know, a time series is when we look at changes, repeated cohorts over time. And an interrupted time series is when some interruption happens, in this case, the detracking reform. And so we might expect the trajectory to be different before the interruption and after the interruption. So this approach compares successive cohorts of students in the same school to one another. So compares cohorts that experienced the reform to cohorts that didn't experience reform. And it also compares these same sets of cohorts to other schools that were similar but did not experience this reform. So another couple of school districts that were very similar to the one where the reform took place, but they did not experience reform. So same state policy environment, but without the detracting reform. So here are results of the high school study. There are two outcomes. First, the percent of students who took the Regents examination, and second, the percent that passed the Regents examination. And again, those are the high-stakes exams that lead students on a trajectory toward post-secondary education. And so this is the pre-reform, and this is post-reform in the schools that participated in the reform. And you can see a big jump comparing pre-reform to post-reform. By contrast, in the comparable districts, you saw the same results in the earlier period as in the later period. So the authors then attribute this jump from these levels to these levels to the effects of the reform. Now, if this reform was successful, where so many others had failed, why? What conditions resulted in the success of the reforms, in this case of mixed ability teaching? Well, first of all, there was substantial supplementary instruction for low-performing students. High school, actually 60% more instructional time. Now, it's important to recognize that this was a relatively affluent school district with relatively few high-needs students. So these may have been the ideal conditions to implement a reform like this, and it's not clear that it would generalize to other contexts. I did find similar results in a 1998 study, Mixed Ability Teaching in an Urban School, where half the students were on free and reduced price lunch, so a more disadvantaged school. And here too, additional resources allowed a Saturday tutoring program and smaller class sizes. However, to get into this school, even though there was a high proportion of low-income students, you had to be interviewed to get in. And so there was a selection process going on. So again, questions about generalizability remain. It was still a diverse student body, but it was selected within that diversity. Nonetheless, evidence is accumulating that successful mixed ability teaching is possible. And extra resources to support low-achieving students is an enabling condition. The most recent contribution to this line of work is a new study of double-dose algebra for low achievers. Double dose, you get 2 classes instead of 1 to teach algebra. So this is, algebra for all is perhaps the newest wave of detracting reforms in the United States. It's the idea that irrespective of how you perform in elementary and middle school, by the time you get to high school, everybody should be in an algebra class. No more consumer math, no more general math, no more pre-algebra, no more dead-end courses. Everybody goes into algebra, which is the college preparatory sequence. So in order to make this work, then some schools, some districts are trying to give low-achieving students extra instruction. And this is a case study of Chicago, which is certainly not an affluent district, not a district of high-income students. And yet the double-dose approach boosted test scores, credits earned, high school graduation, and even college enrollment. So you may have noticed a pattern that the newest studies are tending to look not only at effects at the secondary level, but following students into the post-secondary years, and finding that these effects persist. So this shows the value of following the reform for the long term, because the effects on test scores were relatively small, and the effects on long-term trajectories were actually greater. So the methodology was a regression discontinuity design. And in a regression discontinuity, well, I'll show the picture and that'll help me explain it. In a regression discontinuity, you look at the relation between prior performance and subsequent performance. And you expect that if you're below the treatment line, then you're going to get a boost because you're assigned to the treatment. So, for example, these students scored 50% on the 8th grade test. These students scored 49% on the 8th grade test. There's almost no difference between a student that scored 49% and a student that scored 50%. And yet, because 49.5% was the cut point for being assigned to the double dose algebra class, these students got the treatment and these students didn't. So especially right around the cut point, it's almost random as to whether you got the treatment or didn't get the treatment. So it's a particularly rigorous way of testing whether the double dose program boosted student performance. And as you can see from this picture, from the article by Cortez, Goodman, and Nomi in the most recent issue of the Journal of Human Resources, you can see that the double dose had a big effect, so that the achievement of students who were assigned to the treatment was substantially elevated in comparison to the performance. This is their algebra performance after taking the algebra class. These guys got a double dose and these guys got a single dose. And you can see what a big difference there is in performance right around the cut score. So, substantial effect. Down here, we see that the effects, this is for all students, and this chart is for students who were not only poor, who varied in their math performance, but were poor in reading. And you can see that the effects were largest for the weakest students, which is what you might expect. If you give the weakest students supplemental instruction, they're going to benefit from it. So this suggests that the double dose approach is a way of carrying out mixed ability teaching, maintaining a high standard for all students, and yet preventing low achieving students from falling all the way behind. So what matters may be the supplemental instruction, not whether the students are taught in a tracked or mixed ability setting. Because of course you can do this double dose approach whether the main course is tracked or mixed ability. Now, a second response to the tracking dilemma comes from new research on grouping systems that actually close gaps rather than magnifying gaps. And I've written about this in a couple of review papers that you might have seen. It comes from research by Carol Connor and her colleagues, and it consists of a series of studies on grouping students for early reading instruction. I characterize this approach as one of diagnosis and instructional response. So diagnose where students are, and then organize instruction to respond to those performance levels. So the approach here is to assess reading performance and then input those assessment results to a computer algorithm called assessment to instruction, or A to I. And what the computer algorithm does is, first of all, it diagnoses student performance, but then it recommends an instructional regime that responds to each student's performance level. And third, then, it recommends within-class groupings to facilitate instructional responses. The idea here, the premise here, is that instruction that is geared towards students' needs will help them reach their maximum potential. Now, the optimal way of organizing students might be to provide individual instruction to each student separately. But we don't have the resources in education to give each student a full-time tutor. So instead, we instruct students in groups. And the A to I system organizes within-class groupings based on the diagnosis of each student's instructional needs. Carol Connor and her colleagues carried out a randomized evaluation of the A to I approach. Teachers in the treatment group received the A to I software and training in how to use it. The comparison group of teachers did not receive the A to I system. And she finds, first of all, students whose teachers were assigned to the treatment group outperformed those in control conditions. And moreover, low-achieving students received the largest benefits from being in the classes where A2I was used. So here, grouping is used extensively, and yet inequality declines rather than grows over time. The benefits were greatest for students whose teachers made most use of the A2I system. So one of the great things about studying an online instructional system, or an instructional support system that's online, is you can tell who's using it. You know, you can see the dosage levels, because each time a teacher goes online to diagnose student performance, we can monitor that. So that's what goes into this chart. Along the lower axis here, we see each teacher's use of the A2I system with, from less to more. And over here, we see student performance on the end-of-year assessment. And so we're looking at the treatment effect for students with lower test scores in the fall and higher test scores in the fall, based on how extensively their teachers use the A2I system. We can see that the more teachers use the A2I system, the bigger the effects for everyone, but the biggest gains were for students who were initially lowest in their performance. Now, Connor's results echo the long ago, nearly 30 years ago, conclusions of Robert Slavin, who did a synthesis of ability grouping research at the elementary school level. And his conclusion was tracking can be effective under certain conditions. And those conditions are when students are assigned to groups based on the specific skill to be taught, as opposed to some kind of IQ test that assigns students to one trajectory or another. When instruction is then targeted to that specific skill, and when grouping arrangements are flexible, so they can be modified as the curriculum moves along and as student skills develop. Yet another approach to maximizing achievement through grouping is a way to assign students and teachers to one another such that teachers teach to their strength and students learn from teachers who are best suited to their needs. So here the idea is that we're testing students every year. That's our new approach in the United States. We have these annual tests from grades 3 through 8. The No Child Left Behind law passed in 2002, or implemented in 2002, required this. So we can use these annual test results to get evidence of which teachers tend to be effective with which students. Are some teachers more effective with one type of students than with others? If the answer is yes, then we can assign students to the teachers who are more effective with them. So if we get some teachers who are especially effective with low achievers, then we'll give those students to those teachers. We'll match those students with those teachers. This completely solves the tracking dilemma, because it would mean that each student gets taught by the teacher who's best suited to instructing them. So, will this really work? Well, there are some requirements. First, that we have annual achievement data, which we do. Second, that students are linked across years and to their teachers in the data systems. Check, we have that. Third, that we can test for differential effects. That's challenging, but there have been some recent developments in this area. And fourth, that we find that, in fact, some teachers are more effective than others with different types of students. Because if all teachers are equally effective, irrespective of whether students are high achievers or low achievers, then we're not going to be able to do any optimal matching, because some teachers will be good, some teachers will be bad, and it doesn't help us out of the tracking problem. So if there are differential teacher effects, then students can be assigned to teachers who are particularly effective with students who share those qualities. Students would get teachers who, based on past performance, are expected to bring out the best of them. That's the idea. Teachers would get students who are like those with whom they've had success in the past. Unfortunately, there are a few problems with optimal matching. First of all, it's not clear that there are differential effects, or if those differential effects are widespread. What if many teachers are especially effective with high achievers, and few teachers are especially effective with low achievers? Then what are we going to do? There's not enough teachers who are effective with low achievers to go around, and we're stuck with the same dilemma. Also, it's not clear that these assessments are precise enough to give us the information we really need to identify which teachers are effective with which students. So it's a really good idea. It's not clear that it's going to work. No studies examine this in practice, at least no studies I'm aware of. So we're left with a good idea and challenges in figuring out whether it's going to work. So long ago, the National Education Association, in a review of tracking, declared that neither tracking nor heterogeneous grouping is necessarily good or bad, but rather the effectiveness of grouping depends on the specific situation and the needs of the school. And I think this is an overarching conclusion that still characterizes the tracking literature some 25 years later. Nonetheless, there are some practical steps that we should clearly take. First of all, we should eliminate dead-end courses. These are low-track classes that students get assigned to that don't lead anywhere. I mentioned general math. It's a class you take to get the credit, but it doesn't lead you to more advanced mathematics. It's purposeless. It should be eliminated. Second, we need to break the link between language proficiency and academic content. We've got to stop denying English language learners access to rich academic content because they are 6 years in public schools and still aren't proficient in English. Third, where tracking is maintained, we need to implement high standards for low-achieving students. And fourth, where tracking is eliminated, we need to see that standards for high-achieving students are not lowered. Under the best of circumstances, both tracking and mixed ability teaching can be successful, but it's not clear whether the best of circumstances can be widely implemented. Thank you.
Thank you.